Israel has long viewed Iran's nuclear ambitions as one of the most serious threats to its national security, and recent intelligence assessments suggesting that Iran may be rebuilding or restoring damaged nuclear enrichment sites have intensified those concerns. For Israeli policymakers, military planners, and intelligence agencies, the possibility that Iran is once again advancing its uranium enrichment capabilities raises alarms not only about Iran's technical progress, but also about the broader strategic balance in the Middle East. This concern is rooted in decades of rivalry, ideological hostility, regional proxy conflicts, and a deep fear that a nuclear-armed Iran would fundamentally alter Israel's security environment. From Israel's perspective, Iran's nuclear program has never been purely civilian. While Tehran insists that its enrichment activities are aimed at peaceful purposes such as energy production and medical research, Israeli officials argue that the scale, secrecy, and resilience of Iran's nuclear infrastructure point toward a latent or eventual weapons capability. Enrichment sites, especially those built underground or reinforced against airstrikes, are seen in Israel as clear indicators that Iran wants to preserve the option of rapidly producing weapons-grade uranium if a political decision is made. Reports that Iran may be repairing, upgrading, or reconstructing facilities damaged by sabotage, cyber attacks, or airstrikes therefore reinforce Israel's belief that Iran remains determined and adaptive. The history of confrontation between Israel and Iran over the nuclear issue stretches back many years. Israel has repeatedly stated that it will not allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, framing this position as an existential necessity rather than a policy preference. This stance has shaped Israel's actions, from diplomatic lobbying against international agreements it views as insufficient, to covert operations designed to slow Iran's progress. The idea that Iran is rebuilding enrichment sites suggests to Israeli analysts that previous efforts to delay or disrupt the program may have only bought time rather than produced a lasting solution. Israeli concern is also fueled by Iran's pattern of learning from setbacks. Each time an enrichment facility is exposed, damaged, or placed under scrutiny, Iran appears to respond by dispersing its program, hardening its sites, and improving redundancy. From Israel's viewpoint, rebuilding enrichment sites is not simply about restoring lost capacity, it is about making the program more resilient against future attacks. Deeper underground halls, more advanced centrifuges, and decentralized production networks make military options increasingly complex and risky. This trend worries Israeli defense planners, who fear that the window for effective intervention may be narrowing. Another layer of Israel's anxiety comes from the regional context in which Iran's nuclear activities take place. Iran is not an isolated actor. It supports and arms a network of allied groups across the Middle East, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Syria and Iraq, and factions in Gaza. Israel views these groups as direct threats, capable of launching large-scale rocket and missile attacks. The prospect of Iran rebuilding its nuclear enrichment sites raises the fear that, under a nuclear umbrella or near-nuclear status, Iran might feel emboldened to increase support for these proxies, calculating that Israel and its allies would be more constrained in their responses. The rebuilding of enrichment sites also intersects with Israel's concerns about international diplomacy. Israeli leaders have often expressed skepticism about negotiated agreements that limit Iran's nuclear program for a defined period rather than dismantling it completely. From Israel's standpoint, any deal that allows Iran to retain enrichment infrastructure, even under monitoring, legitimizes capabilities that could later be expanded. Reports of reconstruction efforts are therefore interpreted as evidence that Iran is positioning itself for the post-agreement future, when restrictions may expire or be ignored. This reinforces Israel's argument that diplomatic approaches, while valuable, must be backed by credible pressure and the threat of force. Intelligence plays a crucial role in shaping Israel's response to perceived rebuilding efforts. Israel prides itself on its intelligence capabilities, including human intelligence, signals intelligence, and cyber operations. Information about Iran's nuclear sites, their condition, and their reconstruction is carefully analyzed to assess timelines and intentions. Even small signs of renewed activity, such as increased procurement of specialized materials or construction in sensitive areas, can trigger heightened alerts. Israeli officials often share selected intelligence with allies to build support for tougher policies, emphasizing that Iran's actions demonstrate bad faith or strategic deception. The psychological dimension of Israel's concern should not be underestimated. The memory of past existential threats, combined with the trauma of regional wars, shapes Israeli strategic culture. A nuclear-armed adversary that openly calls for Israel's elimination is perceived not as a theoretical risk but as a tangible danger. Rebuilding enrichment sites symbolizes resilience and persistence on Iran's part, reinforcing the narrative that Iran cannot be deterred or persuaded away from its nuclear ambitions. This perception, whether fully accurate or not, drives Israel toward a more vigilant and sometimes aggressive posture. At the same time, Israel must weigh its concerns against the potential costs of action. Military strikes on rebuilt or hardened enrichment sites could provoke severe retaliation, including missile barrages from Iran or its proxies. Such escalation could draw in regional and global powers, disrupt global energy markets, and lead to prolonged conflict. Israeli leaders therefore face a strategic dilemma: allow Iran to rebuild and risk a future nuclear breakout, or act decisively and risk immediate war. This dilemma becomes more acute as Iran's facilities become more fortified and dispersed. The role of the United States is central to Israel's calculations. Israel relies on close coordination with Washington for intelligence sharing, diplomatic backing, and military support. When Israel becomes concerned about Iran rebuilding enrichment sites, it often seeks to persuade the United States to adopt a firmer stance, whether through sanctions, diplomatic pressure, or military preparedness. Differences in threat perception or policy priorities between Jerusalem and Washington can create tension, especially if the United States favors engagement while Israel emphasizes prevention. Nevertheless, Israel understands that any major action against Iran would be far more effective and less risky with American support or at least acquiescence. Israel's concern is also influenced by the broader international response to Iran's nuclear activities. If rebuilding efforts are met with muted reactions, limited inspections, or slow diplomatic processes, Israeli officials may interpret this as a sign that the international community lacks the will to enforce red lines. Conversely, strong responses from international bodies can reassure Israel that it is not alone in confronting the challenge. However, Israel remains wary of relying entirely on external actors, given past experiences where international guarantees failed to prevent regional threats. Domestic politics within Israel also shape how concerns about Iran's rebuilding of enrichment sites are expressed and addressed. Israeli leaders often highlight the Iranian threat to demonstrate strength and resolve to their electorate. At the same time, they must manage public anxiety and avoid unnecessary panic. Statements about Iran's nuclear progress are therefore carefully calibrated, balancing the need to warn against complacency with the desire to project confidence in Israel's ability to defend itself. Rebuilding enrichment sites provides a concrete issue around which political debates about security policy can crystallize. From Iran's perspective, rebuilding enrichment sites can be framed as a sovereign right and a response to external aggression. Israeli analysts recognize that Iran's leadership uses reconstruction as a signal of defiance, intended to show that pressure and attacks will not force capitulation. This dynamic creates a cycle of action and reaction, where each side interprets the other's moves through a lens of suspicion. For Israel, however, understanding Iran's motivations does not reduce the perceived threat. Instead, it reinforces the belief that Iran is committed to preserving and advancing its nuclear capabilities regardless of external opposition. The technological aspect of rebuilding also matters greatly to Israel. Advances in centrifuge design, enrichment efficiency, and facility protection can significantly shorten the time required for Iran to produce weapons-grade material. Israeli experts closely monitor not just whether sites are being rebuilt, but how. A rebuilt facility equipped with more advanced centrifuges is far more concerning than a simple restoration of older capabilities. This focus on qualitative improvements underscores why Israel reacts strongly, even to limited reconstruction efforts. Israel's concern extends beyond the immediate issue of enrichment sites to the long-term strategic environment. A successful Iranian nuclear program could trigger proliferation pressures across the Middle East, prompting other states to seek similar capabilities. Israel, which maintains a policy of ambiguity regarding its own nuclear status, worries that a regional nuclear arms race would erode its strategic advantages and increase the risk of catastrophic conflict. Rebuilding enrichment sites is therefore seen not just as an isolated act, but as a step toward a more dangerous and unstable regional order. In assessing Iran's rebuilding efforts, Israel also considers the lessons of history. Past cases of nuclear proliferation show that determined states often succeed despite sanctions, inspections, and occasional setbacks. Israeli strategists study these examples to avoid complacency. The rebuilding of enrichment sites fits a familiar pattern of persistence, adaptation, and gradual progress. This historical awareness fuels Israel's sense of urgency and its belief that early and decisive action is preferable to late and desperate measures. Despite its deep concerns, Israel also understands the limits of its influence. Iran is a large, resourceful country with significant scientific and industrial capabilities. Completely preventing it from rebuilding or advancing its nuclear infrastructure may be unrealistic without sustained international cooperation. As a result, Israel's strategy often focuses on delay, disruption, and deterrence, buying time and shaping conditions rather than expecting a final resolution. Rebuilding enrichment sites challenges this approach by demonstrating Iran's capacity to recover and continue. Ultimately, Israel's concern over Iran rebuilding its nuclear enrichment sites reflects a broader struggle over security, deterrence, and survival in a volatile region. It is not simply about concrete and centrifuges, but about intentions, credibility, and the future balance of power. Each report of reconstruction reinforces Israel's perception that the Iranian nuclear issue remains unresolved and potentially escalating. This perception drives Israel to remain vigilant, to prepare for worst-case scenarios, and to signal, both publicly and privately, that it is willing to act if it believes its core security interests are at stake. As the situation continues to evolve, Israel's concerns are likely to persist, shaped by new intelligence, diplomatic developments, and regional events. Whether Iran's rebuilding efforts ultimately lead to renewed negotiations, heightened confrontation, or some uneasy form of containment remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that for Israel, the rebuilding of nuclear enrichment sites is not a technical detail, but a strategic warning sign, one that reinforces long-standing fears and compels continuous attention at the highest levels of government and defense planning.